In the annals of history, the names of kings are etched in grandeur and power. Thrones have shaped nations, and the fate of empires often seemed bound to a single ruler's will. Yet, hidden beneath the pageantry of crown and court, there existed a subtle, almost invisible force, a force capable of overturning kingdoms not through armies or open rebellion, but through intelligence, influence, and calculated patience. This is the story of a queen whose ambition was measured not by the banners she bore, nor the armies she commanded, but by her mastery of the unseen currents of power. She did not merely advise the king, she orchestrated his downfall. She reshaped a kingdom from the shadows, her victory silent, her authority absolute, and her methods nearly impossible to trace. Her rise began quietly. Born into a noble house with centuries of influence, she learned early that appearances could deceive, and that loyalty in the court was often a currency as fragile as glass. Marriages in her era were political instruments, alliances forged with strategy rather than affection. Yet, she turned the most traditional of roles, the role of queen consort, into the foundation of a subtle empire. She understood the intricacies of governance better than many advisors. She read the currents of court factions with unparalleled acuity, noting which nobles harbored ambition, which ministers were susceptible to persuasion, and which generals could be quietly aligned with her objectives. Every speech, every gesture, every carefully whispered word became a tool in a growing network of influence. Her strategy was not confrontation but redirection. She cultivated loyalty not through fear, but through patronage, secrecy, and the promise of subtle gain. Courtiers who once thought themselves masters of policy found their counsel gently but firmly steered by her unseen hand. Decisions that appeared to emanate from the king were increasingly influenced by her intricate web. She mastered the art of patience. Whereas kings often acted in moments of impulse, declaring war, granting titles, or punishing rivals, she waited. Years passed, seasons changed, and the king, unaware, increasingly relied upon her counsel. He believed himself the architect of every decision. And yet, with each decree signed under his authority, the foundations of his own power subtly shifted toward hers. There were moments of peril, of course. Court intrigue is never a silent battlefield. Rumors of her influence circulated, whispered behind tapestries and in the dim glow of banquet halls. Political enemies sought to expose her, to undermine her carefully constructed authority. And yet, she navigated each threat with a combination of charm, intimidation, and tactical generosity. Her reputation became one of inevitability, the sense that she was simply the axis upon which the court revolved. The culmination of her ascent did not occur in a single night. There was no violent coup, no open betrayal. Instead, it was a process, a slow erosion of authority, a quiet reallocation of loyalty, and the strategic placement of allies in positions of influence. When the moment came, it appeared to the world that the king had simply faltered, his errors magnified by circumstance and counsel. But in truth, every weakness had been anticipated, every misstep guided by her unseen hand. By the end of her rise, she had become the true power behind the throne. Ministers and generals, who once thought themselves accountable to the king, now acted in accordance with her vision. Decisions of war, diplomacy, and finance, matters that could make or break a kingdom, were subtly influenced, if not outright directed, by her. History remembers the king for the failures of his reign, never suspecting the quiet genius of the queen who orchestrated them. Her story is a testament to the power of intellect over brute force, of subtlety over spectacle. She rewrote the rules of authority in a world dominated by men and armies, proving that kingdoms could be conquered not just with swords, but with strategy, patience, and vision. In her silence, she commanded more than the loudest general. In her invisibility, she exercised more influence than the king himself. This is the chronicle of the queen who secretly overthrew the king, a masterclass in the quiet art of power, and a reminder that history is often written not by those in the spotlight, but by those who control it from the shadows. Her reign was never proclaimed. Her victories were never celebrated with fanfare. And yet, through cunning, foresight, and the patient orchestration of influence, she became the unacknowledged architect of a kingdom's destiny, a shadow sovereign, whose story endures in the silent spaces between history's recorded words. The queen's rise was not simply a matter of cunning. It was built on observation. She studied the patterns of power, the subtle gestures of nobles, the hidden loyalties of generals, the fragile ambitions of the council. Every conversation was a test, every court gathering a theater of human desire and fear. She learned who spoke with sincerity and who wielded flattery as a weapon. In time, she could predict decisions before they were made, not because of magic or prophecy, but because she had mastered the human mind. The king, confident in his own authority, saw her only as a partner in appearances. He admired her intelligence, relied on her advice in private, but never considered that his dependence was a liability. Where others saw ambition, he saw loyalty. Where others saw manipulation, he saw guidance. This blindness would be his undoing. Her methods were gradual, almost imperceptible. Allies were nurtured over years. Key advisors and military commanders, carefully selected, found themselves aligned with her ideas, often believing they acted in the king's interest. She introduced policies in subtle increments, small reforms that seemed practical, minor redistributions of resources, quiet endorsements of loyal factions. By the time the changes were evident, they were already irreversible. Whispers became a tool. Rumors of corruption, incompetence, or indecision, seemingly spontaneous, were, in fact, meticulously seeded. Ministers argued amongst themselves, courts debated policies in heated voices, and the king, frustrated and defensive, began to isolate himself. The queen, always present but never overt, offered counsel that appeared stabilizing. In reality, it reinforced her control. Intelligence gathering was central to her strategy. Courtiers, merchants, and envoys brought her information before it reached the king. Letters intercepted, alliances tested, loyalties examined, she knew every weakness in her kingdom. When disputes arose between nobles, she positioned herself as the mediator, the voice of reason, the arbiter whose judgment carried weight beyond the throne. Slowly, the kingdom learned to rely on her, even as the king remained formally in power. Her manipulation extended to finances. Royal treasuries were managed with precision, funding loyal allies, ensuring key military positions were occupied by those who would answer to her, and quietly draining the influence of potential rivals. A kingdom's wealth, she understood, was not merely a tool for opulence, it was a weapon. Control the flow of money, and you control ambition. Even as the king's authority eroded, she maintained the illusion of partnership. She never forced him into error. Instead, she guided, suggested, and sometimes withheld information. Decisions appeared to originate with him, yet every consequence subtly favored her network. By the time his mistakes became obvious, the court's loyalty had already shifted. Meanwhile, the public narrative remained one of a devoted queen. Festivals, charitable works, and visible support for the people built her reputation as benevolent and wise. The population admired her, often more than the king, without ever suspecting the depth of her political control. History often remembers public sentiment as a reflection of power, but she had learned to manipulate both. Her influence extended even to matters of war. While the king made the official declarations, it was she who guided strategy, advising generals and diplomats in ways that minimized his involvement but maximized her authority. Conflicts were waged, not always with armies, but with alliances, trade agreements, and political maneuvering. By the time treaties were signed and battles concluded, she had secured both the safety and expansion of the kingdom, often at the expense of rivals who underestimated her. The turning point came quietly. The king, exhausted by years of unseen manipulation, began to doubt his own judgment. Advisors who had once opposed him now deferred to her suggestions. Decisions that once required his direct input were subtly bypassed, executed under her guidance. Authority, once centralized in the crown, had shifted without a single sword crossing the threshold of the palace. Her mastery of subtlety was complete. She had learned an essential truth of power, that the strongest authority is invisible. Force can be resisted, persuasion can be questioned. But a kingdom convinced it is acting freely, even while guided, is the most enduring form of control. By the end of her ascendancy, she was no longer merely the queen consort. She was the unseen architect of the kingdom, the force behind every major decision, every victory, every subtle shift in policy. When history recorded the king's failures, it did not record the hand that guided him, the strategy that controlled him. And in this omission lay her genius. This queen's story is a study in patience, intellect, and the delicate architecture of influence. She demonstrates that history is shaped not only by those who seize the spotlight, but by those who skillfully guide the spotlight itself. She did not overthrow the king with an army. She did not storm the palace. She did so with strategy, foresight, and an intimate understanding of the human heart, a lesson in power that echoes across the centuries. Her legacy is not written on monuments or coins. It resides in the subtle reconfiguration of power, in the quiet victories that escape the historian's pen. The queen who secretly overthrew the king remains an enduring symbol, that true power often works in the shadows, and that genius sometimes wears the guise of loyalty, patience, and silent influence. The kingdom itself was a living, breathing entity, its stability dependent upon a delicate equilibrium of factions, ambitions, and alliances. The king, though outwardly confident, had inherited a throne riddled with cracks, nobles with ancient grudges, governors with semi-independent authority, and a population growing restless under taxation and war. In such an environment, power could be taken by those with courage, but it could also be taken by those with foresight. The queen understood this instinctively. She did not rush, she observed. She mapped alliances like a cartographer maps uncharted lands, noting who could be persuaded, who could be intimidated, and who could be sacrificed. Every family feud, every whispered rumor of discontent, became an opportunity. Allies were nurtured patiently, their loyalty earned with favors, promises, and careful appearances of empathy. Rivals were weakened quietly, often by their own ambition. By the time they realized the trap, the web was already complete. Her mastery of communication was unprecedented. Letters, seemingly innocent missives, carried instructions, intelligence, and subtle suggestions for action. A single letter could redirect a governor's decision, convince a general to delay an order, or inspire a noble to ally with her without ever realizing the true source of influence. She understood the profound power of words and used them like a sword, precise, invisible, and unavoidable. Courts are arenas of perception. To the untrained eye, she was gracious, diplomatic, endlessly charming. She listened with intensity, smiled with careful timing, and laughed at the right moments. But beneath this veneer, every gesture was a calculation. She could sense weakness in posture, doubt in a glance, or hidden resentment in tone. The subtleties of human behavior became tools in her arsenal. By the end of a single evening, she had mapped allegiances, detected potential betrayals, and subtly guided the ambitions of key players to her advantage. The king, meanwhile, grew increasingly dependent upon her. His own advisers began to respect her counsel more than his, perceiving in her a clarity and composure absent from the king's temperamental leadership. Mistakes that once might have been overlooked were now magnified. Campaigns failed, decisions floundered, and policies backfired. Historians would later attribute these to incompetence or folly, but the truth lay in the quiet orchestration of her strategy. Each failure, each misstep, served to consolidate her power, subtly diminishing the king's authority without a single overt confrontation. She also mastered the art of perception. To the public, she was devoted and loyal. To the king, she was indispensable. To her allies, she was a protector and mentor. And to her enemies, she was untouchable, always a step ahead, always operating in the shadows, her moves invisible until it was far too late. This multiplicity of appearances is what allowed her to dominate the court so completely. No one saw the same woman twice, and none could predict where her influence truly lay. Even when crises arose, she turned them into opportunities. A rebellion at the kingdom's edge, which could have destabilized the monarchy, was redirected through her counsel. Troops were deployed strategically, and the uprising was quelled efficiently, but more importantly, the resolution appeared to showcase the king's leadership. Yet every critical decision, from troop placement to negotiation with rebel leaders, had passed through her hands. By controlling the solutions to crises, she maintained the illusion of kingly authority while her influence spread unseen. Her subtlety extended to politics at its highest levels. Nobles with ambitions that once rivaled the king's were carefully absorbed into her network. Their ambitions satisfied just enough to prevent rebellion but contained enough to prevent true power from accumulating outside her reach. Her brilliance lay in balance. She wielded influence not through domination but through equilibrium, creating a court where loyalty was measured not by fear but by opportunity, and where rebellion was often redirected into compliance without confrontation. The king's errors became inevitable. Surrounded by advisers loyal to the queen, every decision, financial, military, diplomatic, was guided by her strategy. The kingdom's affairs were technically in his hands, but the outcome of every action favored her vision. When historians later chronicled the decline of the king, they did not see the architect behind it. They did not see the queen whose patience, intellect, and relentless foresight had shifted the axis of power completely. From the treasury to the army, from diplomacy to domestic policy, her hand shaped every facet of governance. Where others sought glory through conquest or spectacle, she sought control through subtlety, understanding that the greatest victory is one the world does not realize has occurred. Her reign was invisible, yet total. She controlled the king without confronting him, led armies without marching at their head, and governed a kingdom without ever formally claiming its throne. Her story endures not in monuments or coins, but in the legacy of quiet power, the kind that shapes history while remaining unseen. The queen who secretly overthrew the king reminds us that authority is not always in plain sight. Sometimes, the true rulers of history are those who work in shadows, orchestrating events with intellect, patience, and the profound understanding that power, once subtle, is irreversible. The queen's genius lay in understanding that kingdoms are more than walls, armies, and laws. They are networks of influence, perception, and fear. To rule without being seen is to dominate without opposition. And so, she built her network quietly, aligning governors, diplomats, and military commanders with her vision. Every decision taken under her influence strengthened her position, often at the cost of the king's authority. She established confidants in every corner of the kingdom, messengers who reported directly to her, advisors who took her counsel as divine, and generals who followed her strategic plans, believing they were merely serving the crown. By the time the king realized the shift, it was already complete. The kingdom obeyed her, even as it remained outwardly loyal to him. Her intelligence network was unprecedented. Couriers carried letters encoded with subtle instructions. Spies and informants reported court intrigues, regional unrest, and even the personal ambitions of rivals. She monitored potential threats meticulously, predicting moves before they happened. Every whisper in a hallway, every casual comment at a banquet, became a piece of a larger puzzle. By analyzing patterns of loyalty, greed, and fear, she could control outcomes without a single public decree. Even social gatherings became strategic theaters. She observed rival nobles, noting hesitation, overconfidence, or impatience. Allies were subtly rewarded, while opponents were isolated through carefully orchestrated misunderstandings. No one could accuse her of overt manipulation. Everything appeared organic, the natural flow of courtly life. And yet, she was the invisible hand shaping every outcome, from appointments to policy decisions. The king, increasingly dependent on her guidance, began to make mistakes. Unbeknownst to him, his advisors, now loyal to the queen, fed him selective information, emphasizing failures and miscalculations that aligned with her broader plan. He remained convinced he was in control, even as the foundation of his power eroded beneath him. This is the paradox of her power. To be indispensable is also to be invisible. The king's authority was never openly challenged, yet it was systematically dismantled. Every decree, every policy, every decision, apparently his own, was influenced by her strategy. And the court, the kingdom, and history itself remained largely unaware. She turned crises into opportunities. When a rebellion threatened the northern provinces, she guided the king's generals to a resolution that preserved his honor but expanded her influence. Military successes were publicly credited to the king, yet every critical decision, troop movements, alliances, negotiations, passed through her hands. By controlling both the narrative and the outcome, she strengthened her authority while maintaining the illusion of loyalty. Her manipulation extended beyond the court. Diplomats, foreign emissaries, and merchants were carefully guided, creating external networks that reinforced her position. Treaties were subtly influenced, trade agreements tailored, and rival kingdoms misled, all without the king realizing the full scope of her control. By mastering both domestic and international affairs, she became the unseen architect of the kingdom's destiny. The king's confidence waned. He began second-guessing his own instincts, relying ever more heavily on her counsel. Advisors who once served him directly now deferred to her guidance. Policies faltered when he attempted to assert authority independently. The public, seeing a competent queen and a faltering king, began to trust her judgment more than his. Her influence had become institutional, entrenched, and undeniable, yet invisible. By the end of her ascent, she had become the de facto ruler. Ministers, generals, and governors acted in accordance with her vision. Public ceremonies, official decrees, and battles were orchestrated under her guidance. The king remained a figurehead, revered and feared, yet increasingly powerless. History would remember his reign as flawed, unaware of the quiet genius that had directed it. Her story is a study in patience, strategy, and the subtlety of power. She demonstrates that influence need not be visible to be absolute, that authority can be exercised without confrontation, and that history often records the figurehead while ignoring the architect. The queen who secretly overthrew the king achieved a victory far greater than any battlefield conquest. She ruled a kingdom without ever taking the throne. She remained in the shadows, her power unchallenged, her methods studied by few and understood by fewer. Her legacy is not found in monuments or coins, but in the architecture of influence itself, a silent dominion that endures, unseen, shaping the course of history long after the king's fall. By now, the queen's influence was pervasive, yet invisible. The court, a labyrinth of ambition and rivalry, became her instrument. She understood that power is not only wielded through action, but also through perception. Nobles, advisors, and generals, all believed they acted independently, guided by their own desires and judgments. Yet every choice, every allegiance, every subtle maneuver had been carefully orchestrated to serve her strategy. Factions within the court were particularly delicate. Old loyalties clashed with new ambitions, family rivalries simmered under the surface, and the king's authority, once unquestioned, began to fracture under these pressures. The queen did not confront these divisions openly. Instead, she exploited them quietly, allowing rivalries to weaken potential opposition while positioning her allies as indispensable mediators. Intelligence was her lifeblood. Couriers, spies, and secret correspondents created a network that penetrated every layer of the kingdom. She received news of dissent before the king ever heard of it. She intercepted threats, redirected plots, and subtly rewarded loyalty. Every act of rebellion or resistance, no matter how small, was neutralized before it could threaten her carefully constructed system. The king, increasingly aware of dissent and mismanagement, struggled to assert his authority. Yet every attempt to regain control was subtly undermined. Advisors loyal to the queen presented selective information, generals followed her instructions under the guise of royal command, even nobles ostensibly acting against her influence were subtly guided to outcomes that reinforced her control. The king, convinced he was steering the ship, had in reality become a passenger. This is the essence of her genius, invisibility. To overthrow a king outright is violent, dramatic, and easily recorded by history. To guide his failure while he remains the figurehead is subtle, surgical, and enduring. Her victory was complete not in spectacle, but in the quiet redirection of loyalty, perception, and decision-making. Yet her path was not without personal sacrifice. She lived in constant calculation, weighing each action against countless potential consequences. Every smile, every word, every gesture was deliberate. Trust was rare, even among allies, and betrayal always lurked in shadowed corridors. Her genius required vigilance, discipline, and, above all, patience. Years of careful planning culminated not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow, inexorable reconfiguration of the kingdom's power structure. Control of wealth was central to her strategy. By subtly directing the treasury, she ensured that key allies were funded, rival factions remained constrained, and the kingdom's resources reinforced her influence. Every military campaign, diplomatic mission, and internal reform passed through her guidance. To the outside world, these were acts of the king. In truth, they were extensions of her will. Her influence extended beyond domestic affairs. Foreign envoys and neighboring kingdoms were guided by her strategy. Treaties were negotiated with precision, trade agreements subtly altered, and rival states misled regarding the kingdom's true center of power. She understood that sovereignty is not merely internal, it is the perception of strength across borders. By controlling that perception, she ensured that her power was respected, feared, and unchallenged. Eventually, the king's authority crumbled under the weight of his reliance on her. Every decision, once a reflection of his will, now advanced hers. Ministers, generals, and nobles deferred to her judgment, believing they served the crown. The public admired her wisdom, often more than the king. And all the while, she remained the quiet arbiter of the kingdom's destiny, her authority invisible yet absolute. History often remembers the figurehead, the king in this story, but it is the architect, unseen and patient, who shapes the course of events. The queen who secretly overthrew the king achieved what few rulers have. She controlled a kingdom without ever claiming its throne, turning patience, intelligence, and subtle influence into instruments of lasting power. She became the pulse of the kingdom. Every policy, every military maneuver, every diplomatic decision carried her imprint. Yet she remained in shadows, her brilliance recognized only by those who understood the delicate architecture of power. The king's reign faltered, not from rebellion or conquest, but from the quiet mastery of strategy and foresight. In the end, her legacy was invisible to many, yet indelible. She demonstrates that power need not be flaunted to be absolute, that influence, when wielded with patience and intellect, can shape history itself. The queen who secretly overthrew the king remains a testament to the enduring truth. The most profound victories are often those the world never sees. By this stage, the queen's mastery of the court had reached its zenith. Every faction, every noble house, every military commander, even the king himself, moved according to her design, often without realizing it. Yet achieving this dominance required more than observation or intelligence. It demanded the careful orchestration of human psychology. She understood fear, ambition, loyalty, and envy as tools, sometimes blunt, sometimes subtle, but always effective. Within the council, rival factions jockeyed for influence. Traditionalists clung to old hierarchies, ambitious younger nobles sought recognition, and generals weighed personal glory against loyalty. The queen did not crush opposition with force, she redirected it. By encouraging debates that exposed rivalries and planting seeds of doubt, she allowed her opponents to undermine themselves. When a counselor believed they had outmaneuvered her, they were often acting exactly as she intended. Her intelligence network had become the kingdom's unseen circulatory system. Couriers traveled discreetly between provinces, delivering news, misinformation, and instructions. Merchants and diplomats reported events before the king was informed. Even ordinary nobles, unknowingly, became instruments of her will, as subtle guidance or rumors shaped their actions. In this way, the queen became omnipresent without ever leaving her chambers. Every decision, every policy, every outcome bore her fingerprints. The king's confidence had begun to wane. Decisions that had once come easily now appeared muddled. His advisors, loyal to the queen, presented carefully curated information, emphasizing errors and weaknesses that reinforced the perception of his incompetence. He struggled to assert authority, but each attempt was quietly neutralized. It was a slow erosion of power, almost imperceptible to the outside observer, yet inexorable in its effect. This is the brilliance of her strategy: to destroy without violence, to dominate without confrontation. Whereas a coup relies on force and spectacle, she relied on patience, intellect, and the subtle manipulation of human ambition. By the time the king understood the depth of her influence, it was already too late. Public perception became one of her most powerful tools. She cultivated an image of loyalty, grace, and wisdom. The populace admired her charitable works, her measured diplomacy, and her visible commitment to the kingdom. In contrast, the king appeared increasingly detached, indecisive, and distant. By influencing both the court and the public narrative, she ensured that support shifted naturally in her favor. Her power, though hidden, was undeniable. When crises arose, she turned them into opportunities. A rebellion in the northern provinces could have destabilized the monarchy, but she used it to demonstrate her indispensability. Generals and governors deferred to her guidance, believing they acted to preserve the king's honor. Every victory, every resolution, strengthened her network and further undermined his authority. The king's name was associated with success, yet the credit and control belonged to her. Every action was calculated. Alliances with foreign powers were subtly influenced. Trade routes, taxation policies, and military campaigns were orchestrated under her guidance. She ensured that external perception mirrored her control. Allies respected her judgment, enemies feared it, and the kingdom itself flourished under her quiet direction. Power, she understood, is both internal and external. Perception is often as important as authority. The king's isolation deepened. Even those closest to him, trusted generals, longtime advisors, and family members, had shifted their loyalty, either openly or through subtle compliance. Decisions that once depended on his authority now passed through her influence. He remained the public face of the monarchy, yet the machinery of power had quietly passed into her hands. By the end of her ascent, the queen had achieved what few rulers ever manage. She controlled a kingdom without seizing the throne. Her victory was quiet, almost invisible, yet absolute. History remembers the king as faltering and indecisive, but it is she who shaped the kingdom, guided policy, and determined the fate of a nation. Her genius was patience, her instrument was influence, and her power was total. Every decree, every military campaign, every act of diplomacy, though ostensibly carried out by the king, was guided by her hand. She became the unseen pulse of the kingdom. Nobles, generals, and ministers acted in accordance with her vision. Even the kingdom's enemies, unaware of her influence, deferred to her strategies. In every sense, she ruled without ever being crowned. Her legacy is invisible, yet indelible. She demonstrates the enduring truth that power need not be seen to be absolute. The queen who secretly overthrew the king remains a testament to intellect, patience, and the subtle art of influence. She reshaped history, not with armies, not with rebellion, but with the quiet mastery of human nature itself. The final phase of her ascent was a delicate orchestration of timing, perception, and influence. The king's authority, once unquestioned, was fragile. His advisers, now aligned with her, subtly encouraged decisions that exposed flaws or created minor crises. These were not mistakes in governance, they were carefully guided events, each one eroding his credibility while leaving the queen's guidance unchallenged. She understood that the most dangerous adversaries are those who appear loyal. By cultivating an aura of reliability, she made her network indispensable. Generals deferred to her strategy, ministers accepted her direction, and nobles sought her counsel as though it were the voice of the kingdom itself. In doing so, she created a reality in which the king's power existed only in name. Control of wealth became her ultimate tool. Funds were quietly redirected to loyal governors, military commanders, and influential families. Promises of patronage strengthened allegiance, while rivals, carefully deprived of resources, found their influence waning. Through finance, she shaped not just policy, but loyalty itself. The king, oblivious, believed he controlled the treasury. In truth, the kingdom's resources had passed into her hands. The king's attempts to reassert authority were systematically undermined. Ministers, now loyal to the queen, presented selective intelligence. Generals followed her plans, often altering them slightly in her favor. Even family members who might have supported him were persuaded through subtle promises or quiet intimidation. Each apparent victory for the king became a step in her larger strategy, tightening her control while leaving him unaware. Diplomacy, too, fell under her control. Foreign envoys believed they negotiated with the king's authority, but she quietly shaped outcomes, aligning treaties, trade agreements, and alliances with her vision. Her influence extended beyond the palace walls. She controlled perception not only within the kingdom but also abroad. Her power was comprehensive, unseen, and unassailable. Her triumph was not sudden. There was no violent coup, no public confrontation. Instead, it was a gradual, almost imperceptible realignment of power. By the time the court recognized her dominance, it was complete. The king's authority had eroded, his decrees dependent upon her guidance, his advisers loyal to her vision. The kingdom was hers in every practical sense, even as the crown remained upon his head. Isolation was now absolute. The king, once the center of power, became a figurehead. His ministers deferred to her judgment. Generals, once loyal to him, executed plans crafted by her. Nobles, who might have opposed her, found themselves subtly coerced or persuaded. Even the populace, seeing a competent queen and an increasingly faltering king, trusted her judgment over his. By controlling both action and perception, she ensured her supremacy without the need for overt rebellion. Every final move was calculated. She ensured that all remaining loyalty to the king was neutralized, through persuasion, incentive, or quiet intimidation. Factions within the court were balanced, rivals pacified, and her network strengthened to be unchallengeable. The last threads of resistance dissolved under her subtle guidance, leaving her as the undisputed power behind the throne. History rarely records victories achieved through patience and intellect alone. The queen who secretly overthrew the king achieved what armies could not, a complete transfer of authority without spilling a single drop of blood. Her strategy demonstrates the ultimate lesson of power, that control is strongest when it is invisible, that influence can outlast force, and that true mastery lies in shaping events while remaining unseen. Her legacy is silent, yet enduring. She reshaped the kingdom, dictated its policies, controlled its wealth, and directed its alliances, all without formally claiming the throne. The king, once the emblem of authority, had become a shadow of his former self. And she, the unseen architect of the kingdom, had proven that the greatest victories are those the world does not recognize. The queen who secretly overthrew the king reminds us that history is often written for those in the spotlight, while true power frequently resides in the shadows. Her story endures as a testament to patience, strategy, and the subtle, indelible mastery of influence, the kind of power that shapes kingdoms, not with swords, but with vision, intellect, and unwavering foresight. As the kingdom slept, the queen's influence extended into every corridor, every office, every council chamber. Where others saw tradition and ceremony, she saw opportunity. Every courtier's gesture, every advisor's hesitation, every subtle look became data, information to be used, tested, and redirected. She moved silently through a palace that belonged increasingly to her, even as the king still occupied the throne. Her power, however, was not absolute simply by intelligence or patience. It required precise timing. Every promotion, every public decree, every minor dispute had to serve her long-term strategy. She allowed small victories to the king, carefully controlled, carefully framed, so that he felt competent, even as the structure of power slowly shifted entirely into her hands. The king's advisors, now loyal to her, presented only information that reinforced her control. Reports emphasized flaws in the king's decisions, highlighted dissent among nobles, and magnified the consequences of his independent actions. By controlling knowledge, she effectively controlled the perception of competence. The king believed he still ruled. The court, and eventually the kingdom itself, knew otherwise. This is the paradox of invisible power. The figurehead retains all the ceremonial authority, while the true sovereign pulls the strings in silence. History often mistakes charisma, titles, or ceremony for mastery, but mastery, she understood, lies in influence, foresight, and patience. She met with regional governors and generals privately, offering guidance disguised as advice. Each alignment, each subtly suggested course of action, strengthened her network of loyal operatives. Some thought themselves autonomous, some merely dutiful, but all advanced her overarching plan. By shaping these local and military decisions, she ensured that any potential revolt or challenge to her authority would collapse before it could gain momentum. Even family ties were leveraged. Relatives of the king, loyalists who might have resisted her, were carefully persuaded, bribed, or quietly intimidated. By turning personal relationships into instruments of power, she neutralized potential threats without confrontation. Each alliance, each loyalty, each personal connection became a thread in the invisible web she wove across the kingdom. Control of the kingdom's wealth became the final pillar of her influence. She directed funds to loyal generals, bribed key nobles, and provided resources to governors who reinforced her policies. Those who opposed her subtly lost influence, their access to wealth restricted without obvious confrontation. Money, like perception, was a tool of absolute power in her hands. Even crises were opportunities. A rebellion in the northern provinces threatened the king's image, but she turned it to her advantage. Generals and governors deferred to her strategy, executing plans that ensured victory while reinforcing her indispensability. Publicly, the king received the credit. Privately, the queen had orchestrated every detail. This mastery of both perception and action solidified her control over the kingdom without ever spilling blood in the palace or staging an overt coup. The king's isolation deepened. Advisors, generals, and nobles, once loyal to him, were now firmly in her camp. Decisions that previously reflected his authority were now shaped by her strategy. Even when he attempted to assert control, subtle interventions, carefully orchestrated conversations, strategic intelligence, and well-timed crises, undermined him. Each misstep appeared his own, each failure magnified by circumstance, yet all were consequences of her meticulous planning. By the end of her campaign, she had achieved complete dominance. The kingdom's military, treasury, and administration operated according to her designs. Nobles deferred to her judgment, generals executed her strategies, governors aligned with her guidance. The king, once absolute, had become a ceremonial figurehead. In every practical sense, the kingdom obeyed her entirely. Her victory is instructive for every age. True power is subtle, patient, and invisible. She did not overthrow the king with armies. She did not storm the palace. She conquered through intellect, foresight, and the careful orchestration of loyalty. Her mastery of human nature, ambition, fear, hope, and perception, was complete. The kingdom was hers, though the crown remained on his head. Her legacy is enduring, though invisible. She reshaped a kingdom, controlled its policies, directed its armies, and influenced foreign powers, all while remaining unseen by most historians. She reminds us that history often records only the figurehead, while the true architects of destiny remain hidden. The queen who secretly overthrew the king did so not with force, but with patience, intelligence, and subtle mastery, a ruler of shadows whose influence would outlast her era. By this point, the queen had become the kingdom's unseen force. Her influence penetrated every corner of the court, through whispers, letters, and careful observation. Every gesture she made was deliberate. Every word she spoke carried hidden weight. Even in silence, she exerted control, using perception itself as a weapon. Courtiers believed they acted freely, generals thought they were loyal to the crown, ministers assumed their advice guided the king. Yet all of these actions advanced her design. She understood the profound truth that authority is often more about control of perception than control of action. The king, surrounded by loyal advisors, was increasingly unaware that he had become a passenger on a path she charted. Her intelligence network was vast and intricate. Couriers delivered reports from the most distant provinces. Merchants, spies, and foreign diplomats carried subtle instructions disguised as trade negotiations or casual advice. She monitored threats, anticipated betrayals, and rewarded loyalty with careful discretion. Even seemingly minor events, a heated debate, a misdirected message, a minor financial dispute, were woven into her larger tapestry of influence. The king's attempts to assert authority became increasingly futile. Advisors loyal to the queen controlled the flow of information, presenting intelligence in ways that highlighted his misjudgments. Generals deferred to her strategies. Nobles subtly aligned with her guidance, believing they were serving the crown. Every attempt by the king to regain power was quietly undermined, reinforcing her dominance. She did not need armies or rebellion. Her power was structural and psychological. She reshaped the kingdom's decision-making, its alliances, its finances, and its perceptions, all without firing a single arrow. In the shadows, she had become sovereign in every sense that mattered. Even crises became instruments of her authority. A rebellion in a northern province, which could have destabilized the throne, became an opportunity. Generals executed her strategies. Governors implemented her guidance. Publicly, the king received the accolades, yet she controlled the outcome entirely. By mastering both action and perception, she solidified her control over every part of the kingdom. Isolation deepened his vulnerability. Allies who once served him now answered to her. Decisions that once reflected his authority were now guided by her strategy. Even family members and trusted generals became instruments in her design. By the time the king realized the extent of her influence, his authority had already been eroded beyond recovery. Control over wealth and military resources became the final pillar of her dominance. Funds flowed to loyal generals, strategic governors, and allied nobles. Opponents were quietly constrained by lack of resources, often without knowing why. Every military campaign, diplomatic negotiation, or internal policy was subtly orchestrated under her guidance. She had transformed the machinery of the kingdom into an instrument of her will. Her victory was complete yet invisible. She had not taken the throne by force, she had done so through intellect, patience, and subtle mastery of human behavior. History would remember the king for his failures, unaware of the true architect behind events. The queen who secretly overthrew him had transformed the kingdom, guided its destiny, and exercised authority far beyond her title. She became the pulse of the kingdom, its unseen sovereign. Policies, military campaigns, alliances, and the court itself were all influenced by her hand. She ruled without proclamation, conquered without battle, and mastered a kingdom without violence. Her legacy, though silent, was absolute. a testament to the power of patience, strategy, and the invisible hand of genius. The queen who secretly overthrew the king remains a lesson for all eras. Power does not always announce itself with banners and swords. True authority is exercised quietly, invisibly, and enduringly. She teaches that influence, foresight, and patience can achieve what armies cannot: the complete transformation of a kingdom, without ever formally claiming its throne. The court had become a stage for the queen's strategy. Every debate, every council session, every banquet was an opportunity. The nobles, consumed by their own ambitions, unknowingly advanced her plans. Generals argued over military strategy, ministers bickered over taxation and trade, and the king, frustrated, attempted to intervene. Yet at every turn, the queen had anticipated the outcome. She did not need to command armies or issue threats. She guided, suggested, and subtly intervened, shaping decisions without apparent interference. Her influence was everywhere yet invisible, like the air that carried a whisper through the hall. Those who opposed her found themselves isolated, their alliances weakened, their ambitions quietly contained. Her intelligence network had become the kingdom's nervous system. Messages from border provinces, diplomatic correspondences, and even gossip from the royal household were intercepted and analyzed. Every piece of information allowed her to predict the behavior of allies and adversaries alike. This intelligence allowed her to position loyalists strategically, manipulate rivalries, and preempt threats before they could surface. Even crises were turned to advantage. When a rebellion erupted in the northern provinces, she guided the king's generals to respond in a way that minimized risk, maximized loyalty, and ensured her indispensability. Victories were publicly credited to the king, but privately orchestrated by her. The people admired the king's apparent leadership, while the real authority, the queen, remained unseen. The subtlety of her power was its greatest strength. Whereas a coup or violent overthrow is dramatic and visible, her victories were quiet, structural, and irreversible. She understood human nature. Ambition could be guided, fear could be leveraged, loyalty could be bought, and perception could be controlled. By mastering all these elements, she became sovereign without taking the throne. Isolation became his undoing. Generals deferred to her strategies. Advisors presented selective intelligence. Nobles subtly shifted their loyalty. Even family members, once steadfast supporters, found themselves quietly persuaded or intimidated. Every misstep he made appeared to be his own, but every consequence reinforced her authority. The king's decline was gradual, almost imperceptible, yet inevitable. Control of wealth and resources solidified her power. Generals, governors, and influential nobles were funded according to her plan. Rivals found their influence waning, often without understanding why. Every campaign, trade negotiation, and policy decision was subtly guided by her. The machinery of the kingdom had become an instrument of her will, invisible to those who still believed the king ruled. Her strategy culminated in total dominance. The king remained the figurehead, ceremonially revered, yet powerless. The court and the kingdom operated according to her designs. Every decision, military maneuver, and diplomatic initiative was filtered through her influence. She ruled without a crown, conquered without bloodshed, and transformed the kingdom without ever taking the throne. Her legacy is profound. She demonstrates that power need not be visible to be absolute. That influence, patience, and strategy can achieve what armies cannot. The queen who secretly overthrew the king reshaped history itself, leaving a kingdom guided by her vision, though the throne remained on another's head. Her story endures as a testament to the enduring mastery of subtle, invisible authority. By now, the king's authority had been reduced to ceremony. Decisions that once bore his signature were now guided by the queen's strategy, her influence invisible yet total. Courtiers, generals, and ministers deferred to her counsel, believing they were serving the crown. Rivals were isolated, opponents subtly undermined, and allies rewarded in ways that deepened their loyalty. Each move, each whisper, each policy reinforced her dominance without confrontation. The palace had become a living chessboard. Every noble, advisor, and military commander was a piece, some powerful, some expendable, all directed by her hand. Even the king's family, once his strongest supporters, had been strategically aligned or pacified. Every layer of loyalty, ambition, and fear was accounted for, calculated, and manipulated. Her intelligence network now functioned as the kingdom's unseen nervous system. Reports arrived from distant provinces, border outposts, and foreign envoys. She could anticipate rebellion, sabotage, or dissent before it happened. Couriers carried instructions disguised as trade negotiations, social correspondence, or ceremonial planning. By controlling information, she controlled outcomes. The king, believing himself informed, was in reality guided by her invisible hand. A rebellion flared in the northern provinces, a test of authority. Generals consulted her, unaware that every recommendation they followed served her design. The uprising was quelled efficiently, its resolution credited to the king, but every strategic decision had passed through her guidance. By controlling crises, she strengthened her indispensability, ensuring that the kingdom's military and political machinery obeyed her without question. Her genius was patience and subtlety. She reshaped the kingdom not with armies or confrontation, but with foresight and influence. History would later blame the king for indecision, misjudgment, or incompetence, yet it was her strategy that determined every outcome. She controlled perception, loyalty, and resources, and through them, the kingdom itself. Isolation was the final instrument of her power. Trusted advisors now answered to her. Generals executed her strategies. Nobles who might have opposed her were pacified, subtly coerced, or bribed. Every attempt by the king to assert authority only revealed his dependence on her guidance. Even in ceremonial appearances, he was a figurehead, while the queen moved the kingdom's machinery with precision. Control over resources became absolute. Loyal governors and generals were funded, empowered, and strategically positioned. Rivals, deprived of resources, influence, or alliances, were neutralized without open conflict. The economy, military, and political administration, all instruments of the kingdom, now operated according to her design. The king remained the nominal ruler, yet the kingdom's pulse was entirely hers. The culmination of her strategy was total. The king remained on the throne, yet power flowed through her. Every policy, every diplomatic initiative, every military campaign, though nominally his, was guided by her decisions. She ruled a kingdom without claiming the crown, conquered without battle, and reshaped history through subtle mastery. Her story is a lesson in the invisible architecture of power. Authority need not be declared to be absolute. Influence, patience, and foresight can achieve what force cannot. She demonstrates that the greatest victories are those the world does not see, the quiet manipulation of perception, loyalty, and decision-making until control is total. The queen who secretly overthrew the king leaves a legacy beyond monuments, coins, or titles. She reshaped the kingdom, directed its destiny, and exercised authority far beyond her station. She proves that history often records the figurehead while ignoring the architect, and that true mastery of a kingdom lies in strategy, subtlety, and the patient orchestration of human ambition. By now, the queen had transformed the palace itself into an instrument of her strategy. Every council meeting, every banquet, every ceremonial event became a tool to reshape perception and influence decisions. Courtiers, generals, and advisors acted according to her design, believing they were serving the king. Rivals were isolated, alliances subtly altered, and every faction aligned with her unseen hand. The king's presence had become ceremonial. Even when he issued orders, they were executed according to her guidance. Every decision reinforced her authority while appearing to honor his command. The kingdom, in essence, was no longer his. It belonged to her intellect, her foresight, and her mastery of human nature. Her intelligence network had reached its apex. Couriers traveled across provinces, carrying subtle instructions disguised as trade negotiations or social correspondence. Spies reported on potential rebellion before it erupted. Nobles, generals, and governors, all believed they acted independently, yet their actions were guided by her strategy. She had effectively become the unseen sovereign, the true center of power in the kingdom. Even crises became her instruments. A rebellion in the northern provinces threatened the stability of the realm, but she orchestrated the response with precision. Generals followed her tactical guidance, governors aligned with her political strategy, and the king received public credit. Her influence was absolute. The rebellion's resolution reinforced her indispensability while diminishing the king's authority. Her power was subtle, structural, and irreversible. Where others might have relied on force, she relied on patience, intellect, and the careful manipulation of human ambition. History would later see the king as weak or indecisive, but it was the queen's strategy that determined every outcome. She controlled loyalty, perception, and resources, effectively ruling without a crown. Isolation accelerated the king's decline. Advisors now answered to her, generals executed her strategies, and nobles deferred to her judgment. Even his family, once loyal, was quietly aligned with her. Every misstep appeared to be his own, while the consequences reinforced her authority. The king's power crumbled not through rebellion or war, but through invisible mastery and psychological dominance. Control of wealth and military resources was the final pillar of her supremacy. Loyal generals and governors were funded and empowered. Rivals were subtly constrained. Every campaign, trade negotiation, and domestic policy followed her plan. The kingdom's machinery, its armies, finances, and administration, functioned as an extension of her will, invisible yet absolute. The culmination of her strategy was total. The king remained the crown, but power flowed through her. Every decision, every campaign, every diplomatic initiative was influenced by her. She ruled without formal proclamation, conquered without violence, and transformed the kingdom through intellect and subtle mastery alone. Her legacy endures as a lesson in the invisible architecture of power. Authority need not be declared to be absolute. Influence, foresight, and patient strategy can achieve what armies cannot. The queen who secretly overthrew the king reshaped a kingdom, guided its destiny, and exercised sovereignty far beyond her title. History often records the figurehead, but the true architect, the one who guides, directs, and controls, remains invisible. She reminds us that patience, intellect, and mastery of human ambition can shape a nation, even while the throne appears to remain in another's hands. The queen who secretly overthrew the king rules not through force, but through the quiet, enduring power of unseen influence. By this point, the queen's influence had permeated every corner of the palace. Every gesture, every word, every meeting was a calculated move. Courtiers believed they acted on their own ambition. Generals thought they followed the king's orders. Ministers assumed their advice guided the throne. Yet all of these actions advanced her plan. She had turned the palace into a living web of influence, invisible but inescapable. Even the king, once confident in his authority, found himself increasingly uncertain. Decisions that had once been simple now appeared fraught with complexity. Advisors whispered warnings, generals deferred to her strategies, and allies moved according to her subtle guidance. His authority, though intact in ceremony, had become a shadow of her design. Her intelligence network was unparalleled. Couriers carried coded messages across distant provinces. Spies reported rebellions, conspiracies, and discontent before they could threaten the throne. Diplomats were subtly influenced, trade routes subtly redirected, and rival kingdoms misled, all without the king's awareness. Every thread of the kingdom's operations flowed through her mind, her strategy, and her vision. Even crises became instruments of her authority. A rebellion erupted in the northern provinces. Generals and governors sought her guidance. She provided strategic counsel that ensured swift resolution, maintained the king's public credibility, and strengthened her indispensability. Her control over perception and outcome transformed potential threats into demonstrations of her power. The king received accolades, unaware that his throne had become a stage for her orchestration. Her genius lay not in confrontation, but in anticipation. She controlled loyalty, perception, and decision-making with precision. While the king appeared to rule, it was she who truly governed. Her authority was subtle, structural, and absolute, a masterclass in the invisible exercise of power. Isolation became his undoing. Trusted advisors answered to her. Generals executed her strategies. Nobles deferred to her guidance. Even his family, who might have supported him, were persuaded or subtly threatened into compliance. Every misstep he made reinforced her supremacy. The palace, once a symbol of his power, had become a stage for her silent dominion. Control over wealth and resources finalized her dominance. Loyal generals, governors, and influential nobles were empowered. Rivals found their influence waning, constrained by subtle deprivation of resources. Military campaigns, trade negotiations, and domestic policies all proceeded according to her plan. The kingdom itself operated as an instrument of her will, invisible but entirely hers. The culmination of her strategy was total. The king retained the crown, yet the kingdom's pulse flowed through her. Every decree, every military maneuver, every diplomatic initiative was influenced by her intellect. She ruled without proclamation, conquered without bloodshed, and reshaped history through subtle mastery. Her story endures as a lesson in invisible power. Authority need not be overt to be absolute. Influence, foresight, and patient strategy can achieve what armies cannot. The queen who secretly overthrew the king reshaped a kingdom, guided its destiny, and exercised sovereignty far beyond her title. History often remembers the figurehead while ignoring the architect. She reminds us that patience, intellect, and mastery of human ambition can shape a nation, even while the throne appears to remain in another's hands. The queen who secretly overthrew the king rules not through force, but through the enduring power of unseen influence. The queen's mastery of the court had become absolute. Every whisper in the corridors, every subtle gesture at the council table, every alliance and rivalry, she had anticipated it all. Nobles believed they acted according to their own ambition. Generals thought they were serving the crown. Yet all of these actions advanced her strategy. The palace itself was no longer a seat of the king's authority, it was a stage for her silent orchestration. Even the king, once the unchallenged ruler, found himself increasingly uncertain. Orders that once flowed with clarity now seemed to falter. His advisors whispered warnings, generals deferred to her plans, and allies moved as she directed. Every attempt to assert his authority only revealed his dependence on her unseen guidance. Her intelligence network spanned every province, border, and court. Couriers carried coded messages. Spies delivered reports of dissent before it could threaten the throne. Diplomats were subtly influenced. Trade and military routes were adjusted according to her designs. Every thread of the kingdom's operations passed through her hands, every decision filtered by her strategy. The king, unaware, believed he was informed. A rebellion in the northern provinces tested the kingdom's resilience. Generals and governors sought her counsel. Every recommendation she gave ensured swift resolution, maintained the king's public image, and reinforced her indispensability. In the eyes of the court, she was the silent strategist. In the eyes of the king, she was merely a loyal advisor. Every victory, every resolution, subtly shifted loyalty and power into her hands. Her triumph lay in patience and subtlety. Where armies and coups rely on spectacle, she relied on influence, foresight, and manipulation of human ambition. The king appeared to rule, yet it was she who directed the kingdom. Her power was structural, psychological, and absolute. Isolation accelerated his collapse. Trusted advisors answered only to her. Generals executed her strategies. Nobles deferred to her judgment. Even family members, who might have opposed her, were persuaded, bribed, or quietly threatened into compliance. Every misstep he made appeared to be his own, yet reinforced her supremacy. The palace, once a symbol of his power, had become her domain. Control of wealth and military resources cemented her authority. Loyal governors and generals were empowered. Rivals found their influence constrained, subtly but effectively. Military campaigns, trade negotiations, and domestic policies all followed her design. The machinery of the kingdom, its armies, finances, and administration, now operated as extensions of her will. The culmination of her strategy was total. The king retained the crown, yet the kingdom's pulse flowed through her. Every decree, every diplomatic initiative, every military maneuver was shaped by her intellect and foresight. She ruled without proclamation, conquered without bloodshed, and transformed the kingdom through strategy alone. Her story endures as a lesson in the unseen architecture of power. Authority need not be displayed to be absolute. Influence, patience, and calculated strategy can achieve what armies cannot. The queen who secretly overthrew the king reshaped a kingdom, guided its destiny, and exercised power far beyond her title. History often remembers the figurehead while ignoring the architect. She proves that patience, intellect, and mastery of human ambition can shape a nation, even while the throne appears to remain in another's hands. The queen who secretly overthrew the king rules not through force, but through the enduring power of unseen influence.